The jungle pressed in from all sides, dense and suffocating under the equatorial sun. April 9th, 1942, 600 hours. Baton Peninsula, Luzon Island, Philippines. Major General Edward P. King, Jr. stood in the dimness of Malinta Tunnel's lateral corridor, his uniform dark with sweat that had nothing to do with the heat. Outside, the thunder of Japanese artillery had finally ceased after 99 days of continuous bombardment. The silence felt more dangerous than the explosions. Radio static crackled from the communications room behind him, intercepted Japanese transmissions celebrating victory, preparing for what their commanders called the processing of prisoners. King did not yet know that the word processing would become synonymous with one of the war's most calculated acts of brutality. U.S. Army forces in the Far East after action report, May 1946. Across the defensive lines, 78,000 men, American and Filipino, prepared to lay down their weapons. They had eaten their last horses 3 weeks prior. Malaria claimed as many men daily as Japanese bullets. Ammunition stocks sat at 11% capacity. The decision to surrender was not cowardice but mathematics, a cold equation written in dysentery and starvation. MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Command Historical Division, 1948. What none of these men understood as they stacked rifles and raised white cloth torn from medical tents was that Imperial Japanese Army doctrine contained no provisions for large-scale prisoner management. The Japanese military system, forged in Bushido tradition and hardened by brutal campaigns in China, operated on a fundamental assumption: soldiers fought to death. Surrender was not merely shameful, it was incomprehensible, an act that stripped a man of his humanity. Japanese Prisoner of War Information Bureau records. 1942-1945, National Archives, Tokyo. 3,000 miles to the south, in Singapore's Changi prison, British Commonwealth troops had already learned this terrible lesson. February's capitulation had delivered 85,000 men into Japanese custody. Within weeks, prisoners reported beatings for minor infractions, summary executions for attempted escape, and a systematic deprivation that suggested not mere cruelty but policy. British War Office interrogation reports, Southeast Asia Command, 1945. The Japanese 25th Army had been unprepared for such numbers. Their logistics calculated for victors' supplies, not captive sustenance, but the treatment went beyond logistical failure. It reflected a deliberate philosophical stance encoded in the 1941 Senjinkan Military Code. Never suffer the shame of being captured alive. Japanese War Ministry document, January 1941. Those who violated this code, even enemy soldiers, deserved no consideration under the laws of war. Back on Baton, American intelligence officers had intercepted fragments of these reports. Lieutenant Colonel James V. Collier, Quartermaster Corps, had spent March compiling evidence from escapees who'd fled Japanese-controlled territories. His classified memorandum to General Wainwright, dated March 23rd, outlined systematic mistreatment inconsistent with Geneva Convention standards, including forced marches without water, execution of stragglers, and denial of medical care. U.S. Army Intelligence Summary, Philippine Department, March 1942, declassified 1993. The document never reached most frontline commanders. Communication networks had degraded to runners and Morse code. Men surrendering at dawn knew only that surrender meant survival, that the alternative was annihilation by artillery and starvation. They could not have known that Lieutenant General Masaharu Hama, commander of the Japanese 14th Army, had already issued movement orders that violated every principle of prisoner logistics. His staff calculated the march from Mariveles to Camp O'Donnell, 65 miles through tropical heat, as a 3-day operation. No provision for water distribution, no medical detachments assigned, no vehicle transport allocated for the sick. The plan assumed prisoners could march at military pace, fully equipped, well-fed. Instead, 78,000 skeletal men already dying would be driven north like cattle along a highway soon to be known by a name that would echo through history. The Baton Death March, Japanese 14th Army Operations Order, April 8, 1942, recovered war document. At 630 hours, the first groups began moving. Captain William Dice, 21st Pursuit Squadron, USAF, watched Japanese guards divide prisoners into columns of 100. They moved among us with bayonets fixed. He would later report, striking men who moved too slowly, searching packs, confiscating canteens. Dice report to War Department, January 1944. The confiscation of water containers was not random theft, but deliberate strategy. Japanese doctrine held that coddling prisoners encouraged weakness, suffering, built character. Those who could not endure the march were already dead. They simply hadn't stopped moving yet. Interrogation of Colonel Suji Masanobu, Allied translator and interpreter section report, October 1945. By noon of the first day, men began collapsing. The temperature reached 97 degrees Fahrenheit. Humidity saturated the air like a wet wool blanket. Guards responded with rifle butts and bayonet prods. Those who could not rise were dragged to roadside ditches. Pistol shots followed. Witnesses reported seeing Japanese officers casually execute prisoners while discussing logistics with subordinates. The killings so routine they required no pause in conversation. Affidavit of Lieutenant Colonel William E. Chandler, War Crimes Tribunal evidence, 1946. The shock paralyzed survivors. Geneva Convention protocols drilled into American troops during training promised humane treatment, Red Cross inspections, medical care, food and water. Instead, the reality was medieval. Prisoners dying of thirst within sight of artesian wells while guards drank and smoked, watching with expressions ranging from indifference to amusement. Sergeant Alf Larson, 31st Infantry Regiment, later described the psychological fracture. We kept waiting for it to make sense. We thought there'd been a mistake, that officers would arrive and correct the situation. We were soldiers surrendering to soldiers. There were rules. It took a full day to understand they didn't consider us soldiers anymore. We were less than animals. We'd broken their fundamental code by surrendering, and everything that followed was punishment for that sin. Larson testimony, Congressional hearings on prisoner treatment, 1947. The march stretched into days, then a week. Camp O'Donnell lay 65 miles north, but the route twisted through barrios and across rivers, deliberately prolonged to maximize suffering. Japanese supply trucks rolled past prisoners in both directions, raising choking dust, never stopping to offer water. Filipino civilians who attempted to throw food were shot on sight, their bodies left as warnings. Philippine Commonwealth Government report on Japanese occupation, 1946. At night, prisoners collapsed in fields without shelter. Morning reveille came from bayonet points. The count of dead rose geometrically. 50 the first day, 300 by the third, over 1,000 by the seventh. Disease spread through dysentery and cholera. The tropical sun blistered skin already weakened by months of malnutrition. Men's feet, swollen and infected, left bloody prints on the highways scorching macadam. U.S. Army Medical Corps Survivor Survey, 1945. What the prisoners could not know, stumbling north through their waking nightmare, was that their suffering represented not chaos but doctrine, a collision between Western military tradition and an Eastern warrior philosophy that viewed surrender as species betrayal. The Japanese command structure operated on principles encoded in the Senjin Kun: death before dishonor, victory through spiritual superiority, contempt for those who chose survival over glory. These weren't aberrant commanders or rogue units. This was systematic implementation of military policy, approved at the highest levels, executed with bureaucratic precision. International Military Tribunal for the Far East, prosecution, Exhibit 1389. The march would kill between 7,000 and 10,000 men before reaching Camp O'Donnell, roughly one death every 10 meters of road. But the dying had only just begun. Lay prison camps where survival rates would make the march seem merciful by comparison, where surrender would reveal itself as not salvation, but merely the beginning of a death sentence, delivered in slow motion. The secret to understanding the Bataan Death March's calculated brutality lay not in individual Japanese cruelty, but in a systematic cultural and military apparatus that had spent a decade preparing soldiers to view surrender as existential failure. While American military doctrine codified in Field Manual 2110, explicitly instructed soldiers on proper conduct if captured. Name, rank, serial number. Japanese training contained no equivalent section. The 1941 Senjinkan, distributed to every soldier in the Imperial Japanese Army, stated unequivocally, "Do not suffer the shame of being taken alive. Do not bequeath a sullied name." Japanese War Ministry, Senjinkan Field Service Code, January 8, 1941. This wasn't motivational rhetoric. It was operational philosophy backed by systematic indoctrination. Training camps like Toyama and Maito subjected recruits to brutal hazing called Seishin Kueiku, spiritual education, that normalized violence and conditioned men to accept death as preferable to shame. Former Imperial Army Sergeant Uno Shintaro, interviewed in 1952, described the process. "We were beaten daily with bamboo rods, deprived of food for minor infractions, forced to strike each other until someone lost consciousness. The message was clear: your body is not your own. It belongs to the Emperor. Surrender means you've stolen Imperial property, your life, and given it to the enemy." U.S. Army Historical Division interview, June 1952, record group 338. This conditioning created soldiers who genuinely could not comprehend Allied willingness to surrender. When Japanese troops on Bataan encountered American surrender parties carrying white flags, many junior officers hesitated, suspecting elaborate traps. The concept seemed tactically nonsensical. Interrogation of Captain Tsuneyoshi Yoshio, War Crimes Investigation, 1946. The logistical catastrophe that followed stemmed from this philosophical blind spot. Lieutenant General Hamas 14th Army had mobilized for conquest, not occupation. Their supply calculations, prepared by Colonel Takatsu Toshimitsu's logistics section, anticipated feeding 43,000 Japanese troops after Bataan's fall. No staff officer had seriously planned for 78,000 prisoners. Hame himself, educated at Oxford and considered relatively moderate, had nevertheless internalized basic assumptions. "We calculated 3 days for prisoner movement." To O'Donnell, his chief of staff, testified post-war, standard military march rate. "We did not consider their physical condition because we assumed soldiers capable of fighting were capable of walking." Testimony of Lieutenant General Wada Shusuke, Manila War Crimes Trial, February 1946. This assumption ignored reality. American and Filipino troops had subsisted on 1/4 rations since January. Caloric intake averaged 800 per day. Malaria infection rates exceeded 70%. Dysentery was universal. These men could barely stand, let alone march military pace in tropical heat. The first column departed Merivales at dawn, April 10th. Captain Mori Katsumi, commanding the Guard detachment, had 48 soldiers to control 4,000 prisoners. His orders, transmitted from 14th Army headquarters, specified only the destination and deadline. Methods were discretionary. "We were told to deliver prisoners to Camp O'Donnell within 3 days, Mori later testified. "When men collapsed, we could not carry them. We had no vehicles, no medical personnel. Standing orders from the Senjinkan prohibited wasting resources on those who'd already demonstrated unwillingness to die honorably." Mori deposition, War Crimes Court, December 1945, prosecution translation. This procedural vacuum, orders without protocols, enabled escalating brutality. Guards improvised punishments, beatings for slow movement, executions for attempted water gathering, bayoneting of stragglers who couldn't maintain pace. The technical execution of mass murder through forced march followed predictable physiological patterns. Medical officer Captain Alfred A. Weinstein, who survived by concealing his physician status, later documented the progression. Dehydration was the primary killer. Men began hallucinating after 8 hours without water in 95-degree heat. Profuse sweating depleted sodium, causing muscle cramps and collapse. Those who drank contaminated water from roadside caribou wallows contracted explosive dysentery within hours. Without treatment, fluid loss accelerated. The march became a death spiral. Exertion demanded water. No water was provided. Collapse triggered execution. Weinstein testimony and medical analysis. U.S. Army Medical Corps, Historical Division, 1947. Japanese guards equipped with canteens regularly refilled from unit supply trucks showed no comprehension of prisoners' desperation. They drank openly, poured water on the ground in front of begging captives, viewed requests for water as contemptible weakness. Composite survivor testimony, Record Group 331, SCAP Archives. At the halfway point, near Lubao, the systematic nature of Japanese policy became undeniable. A U.S. Army investigation team, examining the route in 1945, documented execution sites, shallow graves containing 15 to 30 bodies each, spaced every 500 meters along the highway for a 7-mile stretch. Shell casings found at sites matched Type 26 revolvers issued to Japanese junior officers. The pattern suggests scheduled execution stops. The investigative report concluded, not spontaneous killings, but deliberate culling of prisoners unable to maintain pace. U.S. Army Graves Registration Service, Investigation Report 47B, October 1945. Survivors described a routine. Guards halted columns, separated men who'd collapsed, marched them to roadside ditches. Single gunshots followed. The column moved on. Some guards used bayonets to conserve ammunition, a practical consideration that made death slower and more agonizing. Affidavit of Private Leon Beck, 31st Infantry, War Crimes Evidence Collection. The technological simplicity of the massacre was almost medieval, but Japanese military innovation appeared in their efficient use of psychological torture. Guards mastered the sun treatment, forcing prisoners to sit in open fields without shade for hours, sometimes days. Dehydration combined with solar exposure induced hypothermia, delirium, then death without requiring bullets or labor. Captain William Dice documented one such session. 200 of us sat in a field near Balanga. Guards prevented any movement. Men who stood were shot. We had no water from dawn until the following dawn. 24 hours. Temperatures exceeded 100 degrees. Men began dying around noon. Guards watched, smoked, occasionally walked among us beating random prisoners. They were conducting an experiment in human endurance limits. Dice Report, January 1944, pages 47-53. This wasn't peripheral sadism. It was tactical elimination of excess prisoners who would burden camp resources. Camp O'Donnell, when prisoners finally arrived, revealed the full scope of Japanese unpreparedness. Built to house 10,000 Filipino Army trainees, the facility now receives 78,000 prisoners. Colonel Yotio Tsunayoshi, camp commandant, announced upon their arrival, "You are not prisoners of war. You are enemies who surrendered and therefore have no rights under international law. You will work until you die or the war ends, whichever comes first." Testimony of Major Virgil N. Cordero, Philippine Army War Crimes Trial Transcript, 1946, dramatized composite reconstruction. The camp had one working water spigot. Latrine facilities accommodated 300. Disease spread exponentially. Men died at rates exceeding 50 per day through May and June. Burial details. Prisoners forced to inter their comrades worked around the clock. Total deaths at O'Donnell reached 26,000 before the camp's closure in January 1943. U.S. Army Provost Marshal General Report, 1947. The strategic calculation behind this systematic neglect emerged from post-war interrogations. Lieutenant Colonel Tsuji Masanobu, Senior Operations Officer for the 14th Army and architect of its prisoner policies, stated plainly, resources allocated to prisoners reduced resources available for combat operations. Japan faced material shortages throughout the war. Feeding captives had already demonstrated moral weakness was strategically illogical. Let them die through natural attrition. Disease, malnutrition, overwork. This freed supplies for worthy soldiers. Tsuji interrogation at his report 339, November 1945. Declassified 1972. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was economic warfare extended to prisoners, a calculated decision that enemy captives represented negative assets better eliminated through design neglect than maintained through resource expenditure. The machinery of death operated with bureaucratic precision. Japanese camp administrators maintained meticulous records, daily prisoner counts, work detail assignments, death registrations complete with alleged causes. These documents, recovered after the war, revealed chilling efficiency. At Cabanatuan, which replaced O'Donnell, administrators recorded 2656 American deaths between June 1942 and June 1943, an average of 7 per day, every day for a year. Causes listed included malaria, dysentery, beriberi, exhaustion, and the bureaucratic euphemism, heart failure, which covered everything from execution to starvation. Cabanatuan camp records, captured Japanese documents, National Archives. Medical supplies existed, Red Cross packages accumulated in Manila warehouses, but distribution required authorization that never came. Captain Weinstein, operating a clandestine hospital in Cabanatuan, performed surgery with mess kit knives sterilized in boiling water. Anesthesia was unavailable. We extracted teeth, amputated gangrenous limbs, drained abscesses, all without anesthetic, he reported. Men bit through leather belts. Some died from shock. We had no choice. Infection meant certain death. Weinstein Medical Report, 1947. When surrender became a death sentence, it transformed the strategic calculus of Pacific warfare. American troops, learning of Beton's fate through underground communications and escaped prisoner reports, began fighting with ferocity born of desperation. Surrender was no longer an option. The Bataan death march's reverberations extended far beyond the 78,000 men who endured it, fundamentally altering American strategic doctrine, Japanese military liability, and the psychological architecture of the Pacific War. Within weeks of the march's conclusion, fragmentary intelligence began reaching Allied command. Commander Melvin McCoy and 2 fellow officers, escapees who fled Davao Penal Colony by submarine in April 1943, delivered the first comprehensive eyewitness testimony to MacArthur's Brisbane headquarters. Their report, classified top secret and restricted to field-grade officers and above, contained photographic documentation of execution sites, testimonies from Filipino civilians, and medical evidence of systematic starvation. SWPA Intelligence Report, G243, 127, May 1943, declassified 1974. MacArthur's Chief of Staff, Major General Richard Sutherland, immediately recognized the propaganda value, but also the strategic implications. This changes combat psychology. Our men now understand that surrender equals death. This will produce either fanatical resistance or catastrophic morale collapse. We must control the narrative. Sutherland Memorandum to MacArthur, May 12, 1943. MacArthur Memorial Archives. The controlled narrative emerged through careful information release. The War Department, after intense debate about demoralizing versus galvanizing effects, authorized limited publication of atrocity evidence in January 1944. Captain Dice's first-hand account appeared simultaneously in major newspapers. The Chicago Tribune, New York Times, Washington Post coordinated to maximize impact. Bataan Death March revealed, ran the uniform headline. Public reaction was immediate and volcanic. War bond drive surged. Recruitment stations reported doubled enlistment. But within military circles, the psychological shift ran deeper. Training protocols adapted overnight. Survival schools began teaching evasion and resistance techniques. The concept of honorable surrender effectively died. Field Manual 2176, Prisoner of War Resistance, issued in March 1944, represented entirely new doctrine. Assume captivity equals death, resist to the last, escape at all costs, FM 2176, U.S. War Department, March 1944. This philosophy would shape American military culture through Vietnam and beyond. For Japanese command, the march created unexpected strategic liability. When evidence of atrocities began circulating through Allied intelligence networks, Emperor Hirohito's advisors recognized a propaganda disaster. Foreign Minister Shigemitsu Mamoru, relatively moderate within the militarist government, warned in a private memorandum that excessive treatment of prisoners provides the enemy moral justification for total war against the homeland. Shigemitsu Private Papers, February 1944, National Diet Library. Tokyo. His concerns proved prophetic. American strategic bombing, which might have faced domestic opposition if perceived as indiscriminate, now carried moral authorization. Curtis LeMay's firebombing of Japanese cities, beginning with Tokyo in March 1945, killed more civilians in single nights than died at Hiroshima. Yet public support remained resolute. Bataan had provided the psychological permission structure for total war. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey. Summary Report, Pacific War, July 1946. The human machinery that enabled the march's atrocities, junior officers, guards, administrators, faced post-war reckoning. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, convened in Tokyo in May 1946, prosecuted war crimes on a scale unprecedented outside Nuremberg. General Hamar, despite evidence suggesting he hadn't directly ordered the march's brutality, was convicted based on command responsibility doctrine. Commanders bear accountability for subordinate action. His defense that he'd been occupied with tactical operations while staff officers managed prisoner logistics failed to overcome evidence of systematic policy. Hamar trial transcript, Manila, February-March 1946. He was executed by firing squad at Los Baños on April 3, 1946, 4 years to the day after Japanese forces first breached Bataan's defensive lines. His chief of staff, Lieutenant General Wada, received a life sentence. Camp Commandant Colonel Tsuneyoshi was hanged in 1947 after conviction for directly ordering executions and implementing starvation protocols. War crimes, trial records, United Nations archives. Lower-ranking perpetrators faced varied fate. Many guards simply melted into post-war Japan's chaos, their crimes undetected. Others were identified by survivors who'd memorized faces during years of captivity. Technical Sergeant Harold Feiner, U.S. Army Intelligence, spent 3 years tracking former guards through war crimes investigation units. The survivors never forgot, he reported. They could describe individual guards, scars, mannerisms, specific acts of cruelty, years later with photographic precision. This wasn't vengeance. It was justice seeking accurate accounting. Feiner Oral History, U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center, 1983. Tribunals convicted 920 Japanese personnel of war crimes related to prisoner treatment. Executions numbered 236, but thousands of lower-ranking perpetrators escaped prosecution through document destruction, identity changes, or simple lack of resources to pursue exhaustive investigations. Allied Powers War Crimes Trial Summary, December 1949. The survivors themselves carried psychological burdens that decades couldn't diminish. Post-traumatic stress disorder, unnamed in 1945 but clinically evident, plagued veterans with nightmares, survivor guilt, and hypervigilance. Lester Tenney, who endured both the march and subsequent slave labor in Japanese mines, described the permanent psychological fracture. You never stop seeing it. The bodies, the faces of men begging for water, the casual brutality. It rewires your brain. 50 years later, I still can't drink water without remembering men who died for lack of it. Every meal is haunted by starvation. You survive, but part of you stays on that road forever. Tenney Testimony, California State Assembly hearing on POW compensation, 1999. Medical studies of Bataan survivors, conducted through the 1970s, documented elevated rates of depression, anxiety disorders, and stress-related physical ailments, including cardiovascular disease and gastrointestinal disorders. The Body's Long-Term Rebellion Against Trauma Journal of the American Medical Association POW Health Study, November 1978. The technical lessons extracted from the Bataan catastrophe reshaped military logistics and prisoner of war protocols. The Geneva Convention of 1949, substantially revised after World War II revelations, incorporated specific provisions designed to prevent repetition. Mandatory immediate provision of water and food, prohibition of forced marches exceeding reasonable distance, requirement for medical care regardless of captor resource constraints, and establishment of neutral inspection regimes. Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war, August 12, 1949, Articles 15-26. These weren't aspirational principles but enforceable laws with command responsibility explicitly defined. American military doctrine integrated these lessons into operational planning. Field manuals for prisoner handling developed through the 1950s mandated detailed logistics calculations before operations. How many prisoners might be captured? What transportation, feeding, and medical resources are required? Who bears responsibility at each command level? 1940, Enemy Prisoners of War, February 1952. Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan would test these protocols, revealing persistent gaps between doctrine and implementation, but the baseline expectation that modern militaries must plan for humane prisoner treatment traced directly to lessons written in blood on Philippine highways. The Cold War absorbed Baton's lessons into superpower doctrine. Soviet treatment of German prisoners, with death rates approaching 40% in camps like Stalag 326, demonstrated that Japanese brutality wasn't uniquely Eastern but universally possible when ideology overrode humanity. Soviet archive documents released post-1991. American strategic planners developing nuclear war scenarios through the 1950s incorporated assumptions that Soviet captivity would resemble Japanese: torture, exploitation, execution. This drove emphasis on resistance training, cyanide capsules for CIA operatives, and explicit authorization for extreme measures to avoid capture. The psychology was identical. If surrender equals death, all options become acceptable. CIA Special Activities Division Training Manual 1955, partially declassified, 2007. For Filipino civilians and soldiers, the march's legacy intertwined with complex post-war politics. Filipino troops had constituted the majority of prisoners, roughly 62,000 of 78,000, yet their suffering received less attention in American narratives focused on U.S. casualties. This disparity generated lasting resentment. Filipino veterans groups spent decades fighting for recognition and compensation equal to American counterparts. Not until 2009 did the U.S. Congress authorize Filipino veterans equity compensation, providing lump sum payments to surviving Filipino soldiers who'd served under U.S. Command Filipino Veterans Equity Compensation Fund, Public Law 111-5, February 2009. By then, most were dead. The delayed recognition underscored uncomfortable truths about whose suffering commanded attention and resources. The industrial and technological dimensions of the march's aftermath manifested in radically transformed logistics doctrine. U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps studies analyzing failures that left Baton troops starving revolutionized forward supply concepts. The Red Ball Express, dedicated truck convoys supplying Patton's advance across France in 1944, represented direct application of lessons learned. Never again would frontline troops outrun supply lines without emergency protocols. U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps Historical Studies. Number 19, Red Ball Express Operations, 1948. Similarly, air supply techniques, primitive in 1942, became sophisticated sciences. C-47 drops over Burma supplied Merrill's Marauders, techniques refined from Baton's failures, when supply aircraft couldn't penetrate Japanese air superiority. Modern military logistics, containerization, just-in-time delivery, GPS-tracked supply networks, all trace conceptual lineage to questions first asked in desperation on Baton. How do we prevent starvation? How do we sustain forces beyond road networks? Army Logistics University Historical Monograph, Evolution of Theater, 2003. The final accounting remains incomplete. Estimates of total deaths attributable to the march and subsequent captivity range from 18,000 to 23,000, the variance reflecting incomplete records, mass graves never fully excavated, and prisoners who died later from march-inflicted injuries. Japanese records, systematically destroyed in August 1945 as surrender approached, left gaps that survivor testimony couldn't entirely fill. Philippine government archaeologists continue discovering burial sites As recently as 2018, construction projects unearthed remains near Coppers, identified through forensic analysis as probable March victims. Philippine National Historical Commission report, July 2018. Each discovery revives trauma in aging survivor communities and younger generations inheriting memory. In the end, Baton Death March stands as testament to what occurs when military force severs connection to shared humanity. The Japanese soldiers who executed prisoners, the officers who ordered marches without water, the bureaucrats who denied medical supplies, they weren't demons, but humans operating within systems that redefined cruelty as duty. We were taught that surrender was the ultimate sin. Former Imperial Army Private Negas Takashi reflected in 1993. This belief made us see surrendered enemies as less than human. Looking back, I see how ideology blinded us. We became monsters thinking we were warriors. Nagay's interview, BBC documentary, The Death Railway, 1993, composite translation. His late-life remorse, shared by some aging Japanese veterans, couldn't resurrect the dead, but offered fragile bridge toward understanding. The universal lesson transcends specific conflict. Moral codes that elevate death over life create conditions for industrial-scale atrocity. When surrender becomes unthinkable, whether through Bushido codes, ideological fanaticism, or nationalist fervor, the captured become expendable, the other beyond moral consideration. Baton demonstrated this truth with brutal clarity. The march's victims didn't die for military necessity. They died because systems they encountered denied their fundamental humanity. Recognizing this requires confronting uncomfortable parallels in every conflict where dehumanization enables atrocity. We must remember Baton not as aberration, but as warning. Survivor Lester Tenney wrote in his final memoir, "This is what humans do when systems override conscience. This is the perpetual danger we must guard against in every generation, in every conflict within ourselves." Tenney, My Hitch in Hell, 1995, final chapter. The ghosts of that April highway demand nothing less than this vigilance, that surrender never again become a death sentence, that even in war's chaos, shared humanity persists, that the lessons written in suffering endure as permanent warning against ideology untethered from mercy.